A secret romance, harsh whispers, and a wedding no one dared imagine could happen. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the suburban street in shades of amber and gold. It was late afternoon, the hour when shadows stretched long across trimmed lawns, and the quiet hum of daily life slowed into something softer, almost tender. The town was neither rich nor poor, just a place where children rode their bicycles past neat fences, where neighbors waved politely, yet rarely asked what lingered in each other's hearts. James walked steadily along the cracked pavement, his shirt dusted with the day's labor, his hands calloused but steady. At 32, he carried himself with a quiet dignity, the kind that did not demand attention, but earned it nonetheless. He was known in the community as dependable, someone who fixed things when they broke, who listened when others spoke, and who never raised his voice except to protect those weaker than himself. His smile was rare but genuine, and when it appeared, it left the impression of warmth long after he had gone. That afternoon, his path led him to the community center. The building itself was old, its bricks faded and its windows dulled. But there was a project underway, an effort to revive the place, to turn it into a sanctuary for art, music, and gatherings. James had volunteered to help with the construction. He was no stranger to hard work. The rhythm of hammer and saw had been a part of his life since he was a boy. His strength lay in his ability to shape what was broken into something whole again. Inside the center, light poured through high windows and scattered dust into the air, turning the room into a haze of gold. It was here that he first noticed. Her dot Claire stood at the far wall, a brush in her hand, streaks of blue and crimson blooming on a canvas taller than she was. She moved with careful intention, her brow furrowed, lips pressed tightly in thought. To anyone watching from a distance, she seemed free, an artist lost in her creation. But there was something in the way her shoulders tensed, in the way her gaze flickered to the door now and then, that hinted at the weight she carried. She came from a world of privilege, raised in a family where appearances mattered more than truths, where success was measured by reputation rather than fulfillment. Yet, for all her comforts, Claire often felt like a guest in her own life, trapped in expectations that choked her spirit. Painting was her rebellion, the one space where she could speak without words. James paused in the doorway, watching her strokes. He did not know her name yet, but there was something in her intensity that stirred him. She seemed out of place in this old building, yet somehow exactly where she belonged. Their first exchange was wordless. Claire felt his presence before she saw him, her brush slowing as if acknowledging the new rhythm in the room. When she finally turned, their eyes met. His gaze was calm, steady, unhurried. Hers was curious, cautious, yet softened by an unspoken recognition. James offered a nod, nothing more, and moved toward the pile of lumber stacked near the wall. His hands went to work measuring, sawing, fitting pieces together with the ease of habit. Claire returned to her painting, but her awareness shifted. The scrape of wood, the weight of nails driven into place, became part of the canvas she was creating. Hours passed this way, the silence between them filled not with distance, but with something unspoken. She painted colors that seemed bolder than before, as though drawn by the steady rhythm of his labor. He built with more precision, sensing the watchful quiet at his back. Neither spoke, yet a bond began to thread itself in the space between brushstroke and hammer strike. When Claire finally stepped back from her canvas, sweat glistening along her temple, she caught James glancing at her work. He did not shower her with praise, nor did he critique. Instead, he gave a small smile, subtle, almost hidden, but enough to reach her dot, and for a moment, Claire felt seen. Not as her parents' daughter, not as the artist who struggled for recognition, but as herself. The late afternoon light shifted, deepening toward evening, wrapping the room in golden fire. Two worlds had crossed, a man of labor, a woman of art. Neither had sought the other, and yet, by the quiet grace of that day, something had begun. A connection, fragile and unspoken, had taken root in the silence of that half-renovated hall. Neither of them could have known then how much that connection would be tested, or how deeply it would shape the path ahead. But in that moment, bathed in sunlight, surrounded by paint and timber, they had unknowingly stepped into the first chapter of a story neither had imagined, yet both had been waiting for. The following days unfolded with a rhythm that felt almost accidental, though both James and Claire sensed it was something more. After long afternoons at the community center, when most volunteers had already drifted home, the two of them lingered. The building, half restored and echoing with quiet, became their meeting place. It often began with silence, James stacking tools into order, Claire rinsing paintbrushes in the sink. Yet silence, in their presence, was not emptiness. It was a quiet invitation, the kind that left space for something deeper to emerge. Do you ever think about what you'd be doing if life had been different? Claire asked one evening, her voice carrying softly across the dusty hall. The last of the sunlight streamed through the windows, gilding her face and fading gold. James paused, setting down a hammer, his gaze thoughtful. Different how? She hesitated, as if deciding how much of herself to reveal. If you hadn't ended up here, in this town, in this life. If you could start over. James chuckled gently, a low sound that warmed the space. That's a big question for a Tuesday evening. But then his tone shifted, more contemplative. I think I'd still be building. Maybe not walls, maybe not houses, but something. I like the feeling of creating, of making things solid. My grandmother used to say, if your hands can build, your heart will not fall apart. Claire let his words settle inside her, and she found herself smiling, not at the phrase itself, but at the calm way he carried it. She had always been surrounded by people who measured life by accomplishments, promotions, social gatherings. But James's words felt different. They weren't about achievement. They were about wholeness. And you? He asked, glancing at her with quiet curiosity. Her fingers tightened around the paintbrush she still held, though she wasn't painting. I think I'd still be painting, but maybe without the weight of expectation. Without wondering whether every brushstroke is good enough or whether it would make my parents proud. Her laugh was brittle, almost breaking. Funny, isn't it? To love something so much and still feel like you're not allowed to own it fully. James studied her for a moment. He didn't offer empty reassurance, didn't rush to tell her she was wrong. Instead, he simply nodded, as if to say he understood. That small gesture steadied her more than words ever could. In the days that followed, conversations like these wove themselves into their evenings. James rarely spoke at length, but when he did, his words carried weight, like stones placed carefully in the foundation of a house. Claire, in contrast, often spoke in bursts, laughter spilling out when she shared stories of her childhood, or sighs escaping when she confessed the quiet loneliness of her present life. And in those moments, something in her loosened. Around James, she laughed differently, freely, unguarded, without fear of being judged. The sound echoed off the unfinished walls of the community center, filling the space with a brightness that even paint could not capture. James would watch her, not with intensity, but with quiet presence. His eyes did not demand, did not pry, but they listened. That, she realized, was what made her laughter possible. He created a space where she could simply exist, without performance. Yet beneath this fragile bond lay truths neither dared to speak. James carried a fear he had known all his life, the fear that no matter how gentle his spirit, no matter how steady his hands, there would always be those who looked at his skin first and his soul second. He had learned to live with rejection, dressed as politeness, with prejudice hidden in lowered voices. And as his connection with Claire deepened, the old fear stirred again. Would she choose him truly when the whispers began? Claire, for her part, bore a hidden weight of her own. Her family's disapproval had not yet been spoken aloud, but she could feel it simmering. The sharp remarks of her brother, the subtle questions of her mother, the rigid silence of her father signs that her choices were already being measured against invisible scales. She had always lived in the shadow of expectation, and now, with James, she felt both the possibility of freedom and the certainty of conflict. Neither confessed these fears. Instead, they built around them, he with wood and nails, she with strokes of color. The community center became their sanctuary, a place where laughter and silence braided together, where dreams were spoken without fear of ridicule, where regrets could be shared like secrets in the fading light. As dusk descended one evening, Claire glanced at James as he gathered his tools. The golden haze caught the edges of his profile, and she felt a sudden, inexplicable certainty. This was not chance. Their lives had collided for a reason, though what lay ahead remained veiled. And so they lingered, night after night, each carrying unspoken fears, but also a quiet hope. The sparks between them were subtle, fragile, but undeniable, like the first glow of embers in a fire not yet seen, but destined to burn. The summer stretched on, and the community center began to change. Walls once bare were brightened with murals, and rooms once hollow filled slowly with sound. Yet for James and Claire, the real transformation was quieter, hidden in the hours. After work, when the world seemed to pause just for them, but whispers travel faster than paint dries. At first, it was only a look. A passing neighbor who saw them walking together down the street, Claire carrying her paint-stained satchel, James balancing a box of tools. The glance lingered too long, eyes narrowing, and though no words were spoken, the meaning was clear. Soon, the silence of disapproval found a voice. In the grocery store, Claire noticed a woman whispering behind her hand as James lifted a basket onto the counter. At the cafe, James felt the sudden hush when he and Claire took the same table. Children who once waved at him on their bicycles now stared curiously, repeating words they had overheard at home, that the shadows of prejudice did not roar, they crept. They lived in the shift of a tone, in the pause of a smile, in the invisible wall that grew between them and the town they had once moved through unnoticed. Claire's family, too, had begun to stir. Her brother was the first to break the silence. "You're making a fool of yourself," he said one evening, his voice sharp with irritation. "Do you realize what people are saying? You think this will end well?" Claire stiffened, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "I don't care what they're saying." "Of course you care," he snapped back. "You've cared all your life about what people think. Don't pretend you don't now." His words stung, not because they were true, but because they touched the bruise she tried so hard to ignore. She had always lived under her family's watchful eye, shaping herself into something acceptable. Yet now, for the first time, she longed to break free, even if it meant shattering the image they held of her. For James, the warnings came from another direction. Friends he had known for years, men who shared laughter and sweat on long workdays, pulled him aside with hushed tones. "Don't get carried away," one of them muttered as they loaded planks into a truck. "She's not like us, you know how this ends. You'll give everything, and she'll walk away when it gets hard." James said nothing, only nodded, but inside, old wounds reopened. He had seen this story before, promises whispered in private, affection hidden away, then betrayal when the world pushed too hard. The memory of rejection sat heavy in his chest, though he never spoke of it to Claire. Still, every evening, he found himself back at the community center, tools in hand, because when he looked at her, he saw not the disapproval of others but the flicker of something rare: honesty. Claire laughed with him as though no one was watching, as though laughter itself was rebellion. And in that sound, he found a reason to stay. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in strokes of violet and rose, Claire lingered by the mural she had been working on. It depicted two hands different in color, reaching toward one another, their fingertips almost touching. She traced the outline with her fingers, then glanced at James. "Do you ever feel," she asked softly, "that the world doesn't want us to be?" This, James set down the plank he had been carrying. He looked at her, the weight of unspoken fears pressing between them. For a long moment he said nothing, then quietly, "Every day." Her breath caught, but before despair could settle, he added, "But I also feel something else. That maybe what the world doesn't want is exactly what it needs." Her eyes glistened, the truth of his words striking deep. In that moment, the room seemed brighter, as though even the fading sunlight bent closer to hear them, yet the shadows were never far. The very mural Claire painted became a silent target of gossip, bold. Some said with disdain, "Inappropriate." Others whispered. Neighbors who once admired her work now shook their heads. And though Claire tried to ignore it, the weight of their judgment pressed harder with each passing day. Still, in the quiet moments after the world's voices faded, she and James found a fragile peace. They built it out of laughter, out of trust, out of words exchanged in the half-light of dusk. But beneath it all, both carried secrets they dared not confess. James, the fear that her family's disapproval would drive her away. Claire, the dread that her love would tear her family apart. And so they walked together, hand in hand yet shadowed by doubt, uncertain of how much longer their fragile world could hold. The fire between them was real, but so were the whispers. And whispers, once born, have a way of growing louder. The day began like any other sunlight spilling over rooftops, laughter echoing from children at play, but for James and Claire, it carried a weight they could not yet name. The community center was nearly finished. Walls gleamed with color, floors sanded smooth, the space breathing with new life. To mark the progress, the town had arranged a small gathering refreshments, speeches, a ribbon dash-cutting. Claire arrived early, her paint-streaked smock traded for a simple white dress. She looked almost nervous, smoothing the fabric as though each wrinkle mattered. James arrived moments later, his steady presence grounding her. They exchanged only a glance, a quiet reassurance that whatever the evening brought, they would face it together. At first, the gathering was light. Families admired the murals, children darted through the halls, laughter rising above the music playing faintly in the background. Claire stood near her painting, the mural of two hands, different in color, reaching for each other. Parents praised her skill, some with genuine warmth, others with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. James, meanwhile, fielded thanks for his carpentry, his calm nods carrying humility. For a while, it almost felt normal. Until Claire slipped her hand into his. It was such a small gesture, tender and uncalculated, born from the simple desire to acknowledge what he meant to her. Yet the room shifted in an instant. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. A glass clinked too sharply against a table. The air seemed to thicken, every breath weighted with judgment. James felt it first, the burn of eyes upon them, the silence, louder than any word. He glanced at Claire, half expecting her to pull away, but she held his hand tighter, her chin lifted, defiant. Whispers spread like fire. A woman near the refreshments leaned to her husband, her words clipped and harsh though barely audible. A group of young men exchanged knowing smirks, muttering. And then, like a ripple turning into a wave, the mood of the room bent against them. Claire's father was among the last to arrive. His presence filled the doorway, tall, stern, the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice to command a room. His eyes landed on their joined hands, and for a moment, time seemed to still. He crossed the floor in long strides, ignoring greetings, ignoring the art, ignoring everything but his daughter. Claire. His voice was low, restrained, yet sharp enough to cut through the air. A word, now. She flinched, but she did not let go of James. "We can talk here," she said quietly. Her father's gaze hardened. "No, not here. Not like this." James straightened, meeting the older man's stare. He did not speak, but his presence was steady, as if silently telling Claire she was not alone. The silence stretched, the crowd pretending to look away while straining to hear. Claire's cheeks burned, but she forced her voice steady. "If you have something to say, you can say it." Her father's face tightened, the mask of composure barely holding. "You're throwing away your future. With him, do you understand? What this looks like, what people are saying." The words hung heavy in the air. James's jaw clenched, the insult veiled but undeniable. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but Claire's grip on his hand urged him to stay silent for now. Voice broke, not from weakness but from the weight of years spent bending to expectation. "For once in my life, I don't care what it looks like. I care about what it is." Gasps rippled through the room. Some shook their heads, others turned away. But just a few watched with something like quiet approval, though none dared to speak. Her father's eyes narrowed, fury simmering beneath the surface. "This ends tonight," he said coldly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, his absence leaving the room colder than his presence had. James exhaled slowly, the tension coiled in his chest refusing to release. Claire's hand trembled in his, yet she did not let go. Around them, the crowd shifted back into motion, pretending, laughing too loudly, avoiding their eyes, but nothing was the same. Later, when the hall had emptied and night draped itself over the town, James stood alone by the mural. He traced the painted hands, their fingertips almost touching, and wondered if art could hold together what the world seemed determined to tear apart. Behind him, Claire approached, her step soft, her voice quieter still. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He turned, shaking his head. "You have nothing to be sorry for." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. Would she still stand beside him when the whispers grew louder, when the walls of her family's disapproval closed in tighter? Could love, fragile as it was, survive the storm already gathering? In the silence of that night, with only the mural as their witness, neither had an answer. Only the knowledge that the breaking point had come and they had crossed it together. The days that followed the gathering were heavy with silence. Claire returned home to find her family colder than ever. Her mother spoke to her in clipped phrases. Her brother's glares followed her from room to room, and her father would not speak to her at all. He carried his disappointment like a shadow, and though no words were exchanged, the message was clear. She had crossed a line that could not be undone. James, too, felt the shift. At the hardware store, conversations cut short when he entered. Old friends no longer lingered after work. Even the children at the center seemed hesitant, their parents' warnings shaping their innocent eyes. He tried to carry on, to remind himself of the man he was, but late at night, when the town was quiet, the weight of doubt pressed down on him. Claire saw it in his face, the way he smiled less, the way his shoulders seemed heavier. One evening, under the fading light of the community center, she touched his hand. "Don't let them win," she whispered. "Not them, not my family. They don't know you like I do." He looked at her, eyes shadowed. "And what if one day you decide you don't know me either?" Her chest ached at his words. She wanted to promise forever, but the fear in his eyes reminded her how fragile promises could be. The unspoken truth was that something had to give. And it came, unexpectedly, in the form of a dinner invitation. Her family requested her presence. One Sunday evening. "To talk," her mother said, though the stiffness in her voice suggested it was less invitation than summons. Against her better judgment, Claire agreed, but insisted James come too. The air at the dinner table was suffocating. Silverware clinked against porcelain, the meal meticulously prepared but untouched. Her father sat rigid at the head of the table, his jaw locked, his silence heavier than words. Her mother hovered with nervous grace, offering food no one wanted. Her brother leaned back, arms folded, his expression openly hostile, and James, though calm, carried the tension in his stillness, his posture straight, his hands folded neatly, his gaze respectful yet unyielding. The conversation began with polite formalities, shallow attempts at civility, until her father finally spoke. "This relationship," he said, as though the word itself were bitter on his tongue. "It is reckless, dangerous. Do you have any idea what kind of life you're choosing?" Claire's voice trembled, but she forced herself to answer. "I know exactly what kind of life I'm choosing." "One with him," her brother scoffed. "Naive. You think love can shield you from the world's judgment? From reality?" James inhaled deeply, about to respond, but before he could, another voice cut through the room. Thought it was her grandfather. He'd been sitting quietly at the far end of the table, his fork untouched, his presence almost forgotten. His voice, when it came, was rough with age yet steady with conviction. "Leave her be." The room stilled. All eyes turned toward him. Her father frowned. "Dad, this isn't your concern." But the old man's gaze was sharp, unyielding. "It is more than you know." He set his fork down, hands trembling slightly, not from weakness but from the weight of what he carried. "Because I've been where she is now. Long before any of you were born." A silence deeper than any before fell over the table. Claire leaned forward, her breath caught. James watched, sensing the crack of something long buried. Her grandfather's voice softened. "I once loved a woman. She was kind, strong, and yes, she was black. We dreamed of a life together. But the world whispered. My parents forbade it. My friends warned me, and in the end, I chose their approval over her love." His eyes glistened as he spoke, the decades-old regrets spilling out like a wound reopened. "I let her go. I watched her walk away, and I told myself it was for the best. But do you know what I've carried all these years? Not pride, not peace, only regret." Claire's mother covered her mouth in shock. Her father shifted uncomfortably, anger warring with disbelief. Her brother stared, speechless, but her grandfather looked only at Claire. "If you love him, child, do not let them steal it from you. Do not make my mistake. The world's prejudice will bruise you, but the wound of giving up true love will never heal." James felt the words strike deep, a truth he had longed to hear but never expected. Claire's hand reached for his beneath the table. Trembling but sure, her father rose suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. His face was flushed, his authority shaken. But for the first time, he did not argue. He left the room in silence, his footsteps heavy. The table remained quiet, stunned by what had been revealed. In that moment, the battle lines shifted. Not all hearts were changed, not all walls torn down, but the silence that had protected prejudice for generations had been broken. And for James and Claire, the impossible no longer seemed quite so unreachable. Months slipped by, carrying with them both tension and transformation. The dinner had left the family fractured, yet something had shifted. The silence could no longer hold. Claire's grandfather's confession lingered in the air like a ghost, unshakable, undeniable. For her father, it became a shadow he could not escape, a mirror he did not want to face. Life outside the family walls was no easier. Whispers still followed James and Claire through the town. The cafe where they once laughed together now greeted them with curt nods. Invitations to gatherings grew fewer, friends more distant. Yet amidst the coldness, there were also sparks of warmth. A neighbor who smiled a little too knowingly, a child who waved without hesitation, an old woman who stopped James on the street to say softly, "Don't let them change you." And so, despite everything, their bond only grew stronger. They spent evenings at the nearly finished community center, sitting on the wooden steps James had built, watching the sun melt into the horizon. Claire painted a final mural, two hands, once reaching, now clasped together, entwined. James helped her steady the ladder, his hand always ready to catch her should she fall. One evening, As the last of the mural dried in the fading light, James turned to her, his voice quiet but resolute. "I don't have riches. I don't have approval from the world. But I have this." He gestured to his heart. "And it's yours, if you want it." Her answer came not in words, but in the tears that welled in her eyes, the way she threw her arms around him, the way her laughter rang out against the evening sky. The decision was made. They would marry. Not because the world allowed it, but because their hearts demanded it. The day of the wedding arrived under a sky painted in soft hues of peach and gold. It was late afternoon, the sun warm but gentle, as though the heavens themselves conspired to bless them. The ceremony was simple, set outdoors beneath the old oak tree that shaded the community center. Folding chairs lined the grass. Adorned with wildflowers, Claire had gathered herself. There were no lavish decorations. No grand displays, only authenticity. Not all seats were filled. Her brother chose not to come. Several relatives stayed away, their silence louder than words. Yet the absence did not diminish the day. It only made the presence of others more powerful. Friends from the center, neighbors who had come to admire their courage, children who adored James. These faces filled the space with warmth. And then there was her father. He stood at the back at first, stiff in his suit, as though unsure whether he belonged. His eyes were restless, his jaw set, but he did not leave. For all his anger, he could not ignore his daughter's joy. It was her grandfather who rose when the music began, leaning on his cane yet walking with surprising strength. He offered Claire his arm. She looked at him with tears brimming, her heart swelling with gratitude. Slowly, deliberately, he led her down the aisle, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "This time let love win." James stood waiting beneath the oak, his suit plain, his hands trembling slightly. But when Claire approached, all steadiness returned to him. His eyes lit with a warmth that seemed to chase away every whisper, every stare, every shadow. Their vows were not ornate, not polished with poetry, but raw and true. "I choose you," Claire said, her voice breaking. "Not because it is easy, but because it is worth it." "I choose you," James echoed, his tone steady as stone. "In a world that may turn its back, I will stand with you, always." When they sealed their vows with a kiss, applause rose not. Thunderous but heartfelt, every clap echoing with the courage it had taken to reach this moment. Even her father, still at the back, bowed his head slightly, a gesture small but significant. He was not yet ready to embrace, but he was no longer able to deny. The sun dipped lower, casting golden fire through the branches of the oak. For a brief, perfect moment, the world seemed hushed, as if pausing to acknowledge that something rare had just taken root. Love that had not only survived prejudice, but defied it. The evening light was fading, brushing the sky in strokes of violet and gold, when the last of the guests drifted away. The oak tree still stood tall, its branches swaying gently as though it had witnessed countless seasons of struggle, and was now proud to host a new beginning. James and Claire remained beneath it, their hands still intertwined, their hearts still racing from the vows they had just spoken. Yet this was never only about a wedding. It was about everything that had led. Here the quiet moments of fear, the whispered doubts, the nights they lay awake, wondering if love could survive the weight of the world. It was about the sideways glances in grocery stores, the voices that had told them no, the silence that had stung even more deeply than words. And it was also about the courage to keep walking anyway. The narrator's voice lingers, steady and reflective, almost as if speaking directly to the listener's own heart. Prejudice builds walls, but love, when chosen with courage, can tear them down. Against whispers, against rejection, against time itself, James and Claire stood firm. Their story is not just about a wedding, but about the quiet revolution that begins when two hearts refuse to surrender. As those words settle, the picture becomes clearer. Their marriage was not a single act of defiance, it was a statement. A beacon, a promise to those who came after that walls do not have to stand forever. Because walls, no matter how high, are made of human hands. And what is built by hands can also be torn down by hands, especially when guided by love. Claire's father, standing at the edge of the celebration earlier, had been unable to bring himself forward, yet even his stillness carried meaning. Change does not always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it begins in the quiet cracking of old certainties, in the way a man who once said never can no longer say it with conviction. For James, the journey had been heavier still. A lifetime of being measured before he could speak, judged before he could act, weighed on every step he took. Yet in choosing Claire, and in letting her choose him in return, he learned that dignity was not given by others, it was claimed by. Living fully, without apology. And for Claire, raised in a world that promised her comfort, but not freedom, loving James meant stepping into a fire she had long been told to fear. In the flames, she discovered not destruction, but truth. That freedom is not found in privilege, but in authenticity. Their story is not wrapped neatly with every heart healed or every voice silenced. Prejudice does not vanish overnight, and the road ahead would still hold shadows. But love had proven itself stronger than fear, more resilient than rejection, and more enduring than silence. The narrator's tone deepens, leaving the listener with words meant not to be forgotten. Perhaps the greatest revolutions do not roar with cannons or crowds. Perhaps they are born beneath oak trees, in the clasp of two hands, in the courage of two souls who choose each other despite the world. That is what James and Claire gave us, a reminder that when love refuses to surrender, it does not just change two lives, it changes us all. And as the night settles fully, the oak tree holds their vows in its branches, whispering them to the wind, carrying them beyond the town, beyond the whispers, beyond the years to come. Their love, a quiet revolution, had only just begun.